A black teenager was arrested for trying to return a found wallet. The police didn't even bother to listen to his explanation, but the truth cannot be hidden. What happened after that will shock everyone. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Where are you watching this video? Jaden walked through the crowded streets after school, his backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. The sky above was clear, and a cool breeze drifted through the city, providing a small reprieve from the lingering warmth of the afternoon. His mind wandered between thoughts about homework, his favorite basketball team, and a small gathering with friends he'd planned for the weekend. He loved these walks home, a brief time to clear his head and feel the pulse of the city around him. As Jaden turned a corner onto a quieter street, something caught his eye. A small brown leather wallet lying in the middle of the sidewalk. For a second, he considered walking past it, but curiosity won out. He bent down, picked it up, and opened it cautiously. Inside were a few bills, some cards, and a driver's license that read, Emily Winters. Jaden sighed and closed the wallet. Well, I guess I better find whoever dropped this, he muttered to himself, glancing around. At that moment, he spotted a girl a short distance ahead, adjusting her phone and looking down at her bag as if she were searching for something. She looked about his age, white, with blonde hair that swayed slightly as she moved, wearing a light sweater and jeans. Jaden's heart picked up. It's gotta be hers. He wasn't the kind of person to keep something that didn't belong to him, and he figured she'd appreciate getting her wallet back. Without giving it much thought, he tucked the wallet into his jacket pocket and started after her. Hey, excuse me, he called out, raising a hand. I think you dropped something. The girl glanced back, her blue eyes locking onto him for a moment before darting down to his jacket pocket, where the edge of the wallet peeked out. Her expression changed instantly, from neutral to fear. Jaden felt the shift immediately. His steps faltered as she gasped, clutching her bag tighter. You stole my wallet, she screamed, her voice sharp with panic. Help! Somebody! Help me! Jaden's stomach dropped. Wait, no. Before he could explain, the girl turned and bolted down the street, her screams drawing the attention of passers-by. Jaden stood frozen for a second, disbelief washing over him. Hey, I'm trying to give it back, he yelled after her, starting to run. Panic gripped him as he realized how bad the situation looked, a black boy chasing a white girl, holding her wallet. He knew he had to clear things up before it spiraled out of control. But the more he called out, the faster she ran, weaving through pedestrians, her voice rising with each step. Please, stop, I'm trying to help, Jaden shouted, but his words seemed to bounce off the walls around him unheard and unwelcome. As Jaden ran, he couldn't help but notice the stares from people on the street. Some looked concerned, others disapproving. They didn't know the truth. To them, it probably looked like exactly what Emily thought it was, a robbery in progress. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't just worried about Emily misunderstanding him. He knew what could happen if someone intervened without knowing the full story. He knew too many stories of how these situations ended. The alley ahead narrowed as Emily rounded the corner at full speed, still clutching her bag. Jaden was just a few steps behind, determined to catch up and explain everything. He wasn't going to let this situation ruin his life over a misunderstanding. Emily, wait, please just listen, he called desperately, but she didn't slow down. Jaden's mind raced. If she reached the wrong person or called the police? The thought chilled him. They wouldn't ask questions, they'd just act. At the end of the street, Emily skidded to a stop near a storefront, frantically scanning the area. Jaden slowed down, holding his hands out to show he meant no harm. "Look, I'm not trying to hurt you," he said out of breath. "I found your wallet and—" Before he could finish, Emily turned her head sharply, spotting two police officers stepping out of their patrol car across the street. Relief flooded her face as she waved them down. "Officers, help! He's trying to rob me!" she cried. Jaden froze, his heart plummeting. This was exactly what he feared. The two officers, both white, immediately locked their eyes on Jaden. Their expressions darkened as they approached, hands already hovering near their weapons. Jaden raised his hands instinctively. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I found her wallet, and I was just trying to return it." But his words were drowned out by the officer's curt, authoritative commands. "Get down on the ground. Now," one of them barked, drawing closer. "I didn't do anything," Jaden protested, backing away slightly. The second officer didn't wait. "I said down. Face on the ground," he shouted, reaching for his handcuffs. Emily stood a few feet away, watching with wide eyes, her earlier fear beginning to shift into uncertainty. But it was too late. The officers had already made up their minds. Jaden knew better than to resist, but panic surged through him as the first officer lunged forward. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Hands behind your back," the officer growled as he twisted Jaden's arm roughly, forcing him to the pavement. The ground scraped against Jaden's cheek as he felt cold metal snap around his wrists. "I was just trying to help," he gasped, his voice strained with panic. "Save it," the officer muttered, patting him down with unnecessary force. The other officer knelt beside him, his knee pressing painfully into Jaden's back. "You thought you'd get away with it, huh?" "No, I—" "Shut up," the officer interrupted, tightening the cuffs. "We don't need your excuses." Jaden bit down on his lip, holding back tears of frustration and fear. "This isn't fair. This isn't right." Emily shifted uncomfortably, the realization beginning to dawn on her. Something wasn't adding up. Jaden hadn't hurt her. He hadn't even tried to take anything. "Wait," she said hesitantly, stepping forward. Maybe this is a mistake." The officers ignored her, dragging Jaden to his feet. "He's coming with us," one of them said firmly. "Wait," Emily called again, louder this time. "I think—" "Miss, step back," the officer snapped. "We'll handle this." Jaden looked at Emily, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "Please, tell them the truth." But before she could speak, the officers marched Jaden toward their patrol car, ignoring his protests. The street grew quiet as Jaden was pushed into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind him. Through the car window, he could see Emily standing on the sidewalk, her expression conflicted. Jaden leaned his head against the glass, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. He had only tried to help, and now his life was being upended over a misunderstanding. As the patrol car pulled away, he closed his eyes, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his chest. And so began a nightmare Jaden never could have imagined, a nightmare sparked by fear, prejudice, and a single lost wallet. The patrol car's tires squealed as it sped away from the scene, leaving Emily standing on the sidewalk, still clutching her bag. Jaden sat stiffly in the back seat, hands cuffed behind him, the metal digging into his wrists. His mind raced, trying to process how things had escalated so quickly. All he wanted was to return the wallet. The two officers in the front, Sergeant Murphy and Officer Blake, exchanged glances as they drove. Both were known in the neighborhood for their harsh treatment of black residents, men who thrived on intimidation and control. They didn't ask questions. They acted on instinct, and their instincts had one common theme: suspicion toward people who looked like Jaden. "Kid's lucky we got him before he pulled something worse," Murphy muttered as he checked the rearview mirror, his cold eyes locking onto Jaden. Blake gave a short laugh. "Yeah, probably saved that girl from a mugging." Jaden's jaw clenched, frustration burning in his chest. "I was just trying to give her wallet back," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure you were," Blake sneered without turning around. "That's what they all say." Jaden leaned back against the seat, the helplessness settling deeper with every mile they drove. There was no explaining himself to these men. They'd already made up their minds. Meanwhile, back at the scene, Emily hesitated. She could feel the weight of guilt pressing on her, realizing that she might have misjudged the situation. Her heart pounded as she replayed the events in her mind, the boy's voice calling out, his hands raised in surrender. He hadn't tried to hurt her. He only wanted to help. But now he was gone, taken by the police because of her panic. She glanced around, noticing the growing stares from people on the street, some whispering among themselves. A couple of them had pulled out their phones to record the incident, capturing the harsh arrest. Emily bit her lip, knowing she needed to act. If she didn't speak up now, it might be too late. The patrol car pulled into the police station's parking lot, the engine rumbling to a stop. Murphy and Blake yanked the door open and dragged Jaden out roughly, ignoring his protests. They marched him inside, pushing him through the bustling station toward a small holding room. "You sit tight, kid," Murphy growled, shoving Jaden into a metal chair. "We'll figure out what to do with you soon enough." Jaden sat quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, thinking about his parents. What would they say when they found out? Would they even find out? He looked around the cold, fluorescent-lit room. The walls were bare except for a clock ticking loudly in the background, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Jaden let out a shaky breath, trying to keep himself together. He'd done nothing wrong, but here he was, sitting in a holding room, cuffed and treated like a criminal. As Murphy and Blake left the room, they exchanged smug glances. They saw this as just another routine arrest, another troublemaker off the streets. But outside the station, things were starting to unravel. Emily had finally gathered the courage to act. She ran toward the station, her heart hammering in her chest. She needed to tell the truth before things got worse. At the same time, Jaden's parents were growing increasingly worried. They had tried calling him multiple times, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in as they contacted his friends, only to find that no one had seen him since school let out. His mother, Michelle, paced the living room, clutching her phone. "He wouldn't just disappear like this," she whispered anxiously to her husband, Robert, who sat beside her, his face tight with worry. Robert picked up his car keys. "We're going to find him," he said firmly. "Check the schools, the park, anywhere he might have gone." But deep down, they both feared the worst. They knew all too well how these things could happen. Back at the station, Jaden sat quietly, trying to hold back tears of frustration. His hands ached from the cuffs, and every minute that passed felt like another step deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The door to the holding room swung open, and Murphy stepped in, a smug grin on his face. "You better hope that girl you scared comes in with a good excuse, kid," he sneered. "Otherwise, you'll be spending a long night here." Jaden met his gaze, his expression calm despite the anger burning inside him. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. Murphy scoffed. Yeah, tell it to the judge." As the tension inside the station built, Emily burst through the front doors, her breath coming in short gasps. She approached the front desk, her voice shaky but determined. "I need to talk to someone about a boy you just arrested," she said quickly. The officer behind the desk barely looked up. "You'll have to wait, miss. We're busy." "No, you don't understand," Emily insisted, her voice rising. "He didn't do anything wrong. He was trying to return my wallet." The officer raised an eyebrow but remained unimpressed. "If that's the case, someone will sort it out eventually." Emily clenched her fists, frustration boiling over. "It's not eventually. You've got him locked up for no reason right now." At that moment, Murphy and Blake appeared from the hallway. Murphy gave her a cold smile. "Miss Winters, right? Don't worry, we've got everything under control." Emily shook her head furiously. "No, you don't. I made a mistake. He wasn't trying to steal from me. He was helping." Murphy's smile faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered. "Well, that's not how it looked out there." Emily took a step forward, her eyes blazing. "I know what it looked like, but you're supposed to listen, aren't you? You're supposed to figure out the truth." Blake crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "You want us to believe that this kid just happened to find your wallet and chase you down to return it?" "Yes," Emily snapped, her voice filled with frustration. "That's exactly what happened." Murphy and Blake exchanged glances. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed their faces. Inside the holding room, Jaden sat quietly, listening to the muffled voices outside. Maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening. But he knew that even if Emily's words reached the right ears, it might not be enough. The officers had already made their assumptions, and assumptions were hard to undo. The tension in the station hung heavy in the air, like the calm before a storm. The truth was starting to emerge, but whether it would be enough to set things right remained to be seen. Jaden sat still in the dimly lit holding room, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His legs jittered uncontrollably beneath the table, the clock on the wall ticking loudly, each second dragging on like hours. He hadn't done anything wrong. That thought echoed relentlessly in his mind, but it offered no comfort. He shifted in his chair, his hands aching from the tight cuffs. No one had told him anything since he'd been dragged in. Outside the room, muffled voices and ringing phones reminded him that life carried on as usual beyond these walls. But for him, time had stopped. How long would they keep him here? Would anyone believe the truth? Meanwhile, back at home, Jaden's parents were growing frantic. His mother, Michelle, paced the living room, phone in hand, calling his number again and again. Each call went straight to voicemail, the automated message fueling her growing panic. "He's not answering," she said, her voice strained as she glanced at her husband. What if something happened? What if... Robert, Jaden's father, interrupted gently but firmly. "We're going to find him. He probably just lost track of time. Let's check the places he likes to hang out." But even as he spoke, Robert's jaw tightened. He knew the neighborhood. He knew how things could go wrong. Michelle nodded, though worry shadowed her every movement. They grabbed their coats and headed out the door, the fear gnawing at them. What if Jaden was in trouble? And worse, what if no one was there to help? Back at the police station, Jaden rested his head against the cold metal table, trying to stay calm. He thought of his parents and how worried they must be. They had always warned him about situations like this, how people would judge him before knowing him, how they'd assume the worst because of the color of his skin. And now, He was living the nightmare they had tried to prepare him for. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the holding room. Jaden sat up as the door swung open, revealing Murphy, the officer who had arrested him. Murphy leaned against the doorframe with a smug expression. "You're awfully quiet now, kid," Murphy sneered. "You realize you're in real trouble, don't you?" Jaden met his gaze but said nothing. What was the point? They had already decided he was guilty. Outside the station, Emily stood nervously at the front desk, struggling to get someone's attention. She had worked up the courage to come back and tell the truth, but the officers were treating her like she didn't matter. "I need to talk to someone about the boy you brought in," she told the officer behind the desk. "He didn't steal from me. He was trying to help." The officer gave her a disinterested glance. "You can file a report, miss. It'll get looked at." Emily's frustration boiled over. "He's innocent. You arrested him for no reason. Can't you just let him go?" Murphy stepped forward from the hallway, smirking as he approached the desk. "We've got everything under control, Miss Winters. You can go on home." Emily shook her head, her eyes filled with guilt and determination. "I made a mistake. I told you it wasn't what it looked like. Please, just let him go." Murphy's expression darkened. "That's not how it works, miss. Once someone's in custody, there's a process." At the same time, Michelle and Robert were driving through the neighborhood, calling everyone they could think of. Friends, teachers, anyone who might know where Jaden was. Each call ended the same way. No one had seen him since school let out. Their fear grew with each passing minute. Robert tightened his grip on the steering wheel, trying to stay focused. "We need to check the police station," he said, his voice grim. "If something happened—" Michelle's breath hitched. "You think they arrested him?" Robert didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew how quickly things could escalate, how easily a misunderstanding could turn into something much worse. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, Emily stood outside the front entrance, her arms folded, waiting anxiously. Michelle and Robert jumped out of the car and hurried toward the entrance, their expressions tense with worry. "Excuse me," Michelle called to Emily. "Have you seen a boy, about 16, tall, wearing a red jacket?" Emily's heart sank. "Yes. I think he's inside. They arrested him, but it was a mistake. I tried to tell them." Michelle's eyes widened. "They arrested him?" Her voice cracked with disbelief and anger. Emily nodded, guilt heavy in her expression. I thought he was trying to steal from me, but he wasn't. He found my wallet and was trying to give it back." Robert clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tight. "Where is he now?" Inside the holding room, Jaden stared at the ceiling, trying to keep the fear at bay. Would anyone come for him? Would anyone believe him? The door opened suddenly, and he looked up, hoping to see a familiar face. But it was Murphy again, smirking as always. "You got visitors, kid," Murphy said, stepping aside. Jaden's heart leapt as he saw his parents step into the room, their expressions a mix of relief and anger. Michelle rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly despite the cuffs still on his wrists. "Are you okay?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Jaden nodded, though the tightness in his chest didn't ease. "I'm okay." Robert turned to Murphy, his expression cold and sharp. "We want him released, now." Murphy crossed his arms. "We'll see about that." As Murphy led them toward the front desk, Emily followed closely behind, determined to make things right. This was her fault, and she wasn't going to leave until they fixed it. "I told you," Emily said firmly to the officers at the desk. "He didn't do anything wrong. I need you to release him." The officers exchanged glances, but Murphy remained defiant. "It's not that simple, miss. We have protocols." "Your protocols are wrong," Robert said sternly. "You arrested my son without cause, and you will release him." The tension in the room thickened as more officers gathered around, drawn by the commotion. Jaden's parents stood firm, refusing to back down. And for the first time, Murphy and the others began to realize this wasn't going to end quietly. The truth was out now, and Jaden could see the shift in the room. They knew they were wrong, but admitting it would take more than just words. It would take accountability. And as Jaden stood beside his parents, his heart still heavy but hopeful, he knew this was far from over. The fight for justice had only just begun. The tension in the police station was palpable as Michelle and Robert stood their ground. Jaden, still cuffed, stayed close to his parents, sensing the rising anger in his father and the fear masked by determination in his mother. Emily hovered nearby, guilt etched on her face, but her presence was not enough to sway the officers just yet. The fight was only beginning. Murphy leaned lazily against the desk, arms folded across his chest. "Look," he said with a mocking tone, "it's not personal. We're just doing our job." Michelle stepped forward, her voice firm and trembling with anger. "Your job is to protect and serve, not harass and detain innocent children." Murphy shrugged. "You wouldn't believe how many kids like him we deal with. It's always the same story." Robert's fists clenched at his sides. "You mean black kids, don't you?" His voice was low but sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Murphy smirked but said nothing, the silence louder than words. Meanwhile, the scene outside the station began to shift. Word of Jaden's wrongful arrest had spread through calls and texts. Several family friends and neighbors began to arrive, lingering just outside the entrance, their faces set with concern and quiet anger. Among them was Mr. Turner, a well-known community advocate who had dealt with cases of police misconduct in the past. When he received a call from Michelle about Jaden's situation, he dropped everything to come to the station. He knew how critical it was to act fast before things were swept under the rug. Turner was a tall man with a calm but commanding presence. He wore a simple button-up shirt and carried a leather briefcase. Nothing flashy, but enough to show he meant business. As soon as he entered the station, the officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing him. Murphy narrowed his eyes. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "The neighborhood lawyer." Turner approached Michelle and Robert with a reassuring nod, then turned to face Murphy and the officers. "I hear you've got a kid locked up without cause," he said smoothly, though his tone carried a subtle threat. Murphy straightened. "We had a report of a robbery. We were just doing our job." Turner's expression didn't change. "Did you verify the report? Or did you just see a black boy with a white girl and assume the worst?" Murphy opened his mouth to respond, but Turner held up a hand, cutting him off. "We both know how this looks, Sergeant. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to get this boy released." As the standoff continued, Emily stepped closer, her guilt mounting. "It's my fault," she admitted, her voice shaky but determined. "I panicked, and I said he stole from me, but he didn't. He was trying to return my wallet." Turner nodded in approval, while Murphy's face tightened in frustration. The truth was unraveling, and there was no stopping it. Michelle crossed her arms, glaring at the officers. "You heard her. My son is innocent. Release him." Murphy hesitated, looking toward Blake for support, but Blake shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the unfolding scene. Turner leaned closer to Murphy, lowering his voice, but keeping it sharp. "If you don't release Jaden right now, I'll have a formal complaint filed within the hour. And believe me, Sergeant, the media will love this story." Murphy gritted his teeth. He knew Turner wasn't bluffing. The growing crowd outside, the parents standing firm, and now the presence of a well-known advocate, this wasn't going to go away quietly. "Fine," Murphy muttered. "Let me get the paperwork." As Murphy stomped away, Jaden's parents turned to him, their expressions softening slightly. Michelle knelt beside him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "We're getting you out of here, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jaden gave a small nod, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. He wanted to believe it was over, but a part of him knew it wasn't. Turner placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "We'll get him out, and we'll make sure they pay for what they did," he said quietly but firmly. Robert gave a slow nod, though the anger in his eyes didn't fade. Minutes later, Murphy returned with the release forms, his face tight with frustration. "You're free to go," he said gruffly, unlocking the cuffs from Jaden's wrists. Jaden rubbed his sore wrists, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. His parents wrapped their arms around him, holding him close for a moment before they turned to leave. As they made their way toward the exit, Emily followed closely, her guilt still weighing heavily on her. She reached out hesitantly toward Jaden. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jaden stopped, meeting her gaze. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but the pain of the night's events lingered. "It's okay," he said quietly, though it didn't quite feel that way. They stepped outside into the cool night air, where neighbors and family friends waited anxiously. A cheer of relief spread through the small crowd as they saw Jaden walk free. Turner turned to Murphy one last time, giving him a warning glance. "This isn't over, Sergeant. You'll be hearing from us." Murphy scowled but said nothing. He knew the damage was done. As Jaden and his family made their way to the car, the weight of the night's events began to lift, though the anger and sadness still lingered beneath the surface. They had won this battle, but the fight for justice was far from over. Jaden sat quietly in the back seat of his parents' car, his hands still aching from the cuffs, though the worst of the night seemed to be behind him. His father drove in silence, gripping the wheel tightly, while his mother sat beside him, holding back tears. But Jaden knew this wasn't truly over, not until those officers faced the consequences for what they did. By the next morning, things began to shift rapidly. Michelle had wasted no time contacting friends, community leaders, and local reporters, spreading the word about what happened. The footage taken by bystanders the previous night was already circulating online, showing the harsh treatment Jaden endured. The incident was gaining traction. The video went viral within hours, spreading across social media with hashtags like #JusticeForJaden and #StopPoliceBrutality. Comments flooded in, expressing outrage at the officers' actions, and demands for accountability grew louder. People were sharing their own stories of racial profiling, adding fuel to the growing movement. Back at the police station, the mood had shifted. Murphy and Blake sat in the break room, scrolling through their phones, watching as the public's fury exploded across the internet. "This is getting out of hand," Blake muttered, swiping through the countless comments condemning their actions. Murphy sneered, though unease flickered in his eyes. "People always scream online. It'll blow over." Blake didn't look convinced. It's different this time. That kid's family has connections, and the whole neighborhood's behind them." Murphy scowled, tossing his phone onto the table. He knew Blake was right, but he wasn't ready to admit it. They had crossed a line, and now the consequences were catching up to them. Meanwhile, Turner, the advocate, worked swiftly to build a case against the officers. He contacted witnesses who had been at the scene and gathered statements, ensuring that the full truth would come to light. Jaden's parents were relentless, filing formal complaints and demanding an internal investigation. "Those officers need to be held accountable," Robert said during one of their meetings with Turner. "This can't just go away." Michelle nodded, her expression hardened. "If we don't fight this, it'll happen to someone else's kid." Turner assured them that they were doing everything right. The police department would have no choice but to act. In response to the growing public outcry, the police department announced an internal investigation into Murphy and Blake's conduct. The announcement came too late to calm the outrage. Protesters gathered outside the station holding signs that read, "Justice for Jaden" and "End Racial Profiling." The pressure mounted as reporters arrived, asking questions that the department struggled to answer. How could two officers arrest an innocent boy without cause? Why was excessive force used? Murphy and Blake were placed on temporary leave, but the community demanded more. They wanted real accountability, not just a slap on the wrist. Jaden's family watched as the movement grew, feeling both hope and exhaustion. Jaden himself remained quiet, still processing the events. He hadn't expected his life to become the center of such a storm. Emily reached out to Jaden's parents, offering to testify in support of him. "It's the least I can do," she said earnestly. "I caused all of this." Michelle accepted her offer, though the pain of the experience still lingered. "We appreciate it," she said, her voice tight. "But this is bigger than just you and Jaden." Emily nodded, understanding that she had learned a harsh lesson about the consequences of prejudice. As the investigation progressed, more people began to speak out about Murphy and Blake's misconduct. Other families came forward, sharing stories of how the officers had harassed them in the past. The department could no longer ignore the pattern. Turner worked tirelessly, ensuring that every complaint was documented, every voice heard. He knew that real change required more than just firing a few bad officers. It required confronting the entire system that allowed them to act with impunity. Weeks later, the police department held a press conference announcing the results of the investigation. Murphy and Blake were officially found guilty of misconduct and disciplinary action was taken. They were stripped of their badges, and the department vowed to implement new training programs focused on racial bias. But for Jaden and his family, the victory was bittersweet. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies could undo the trauma they had endured. As they stood on the steps of the police station, reporters swarmed around them, cameras flashing. Turner spoke on behalf of the family, addressing the crowd with measured words. "This is a step forward, but it's not the end," he said. "We must continue to fight for justice, not just for Jaden, but for every child who has ever been judged unfairly." Jaden stood beside his parents, the weight of the experience still heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't wanted to be a symbol, but now he was, and he knew he had to carry that responsibility with grace. As they left the press conference, Jaden turned to his parents, a hint of resolve in his eyes. "I want to do something," he said quietly. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Michelle smiled, pride and sadness mingling in her expression. "We will, baby," she whispered. "We'll make sure of it." And with that, they walked away from the station, knowing that their fight wasn't over, but also knowing that they had taken the first step toward meaningful change. The air was crisp on the day that Emily arrived at Jaden's house. She stood on the doorstep, her heart pounding in her chest as she hesitated, unsure if she should knock. She had caused so much pain, and now she was here to face the consequences. She took a deep breath and tapped on the door, her palms damp with nerves. The door opened slowly, and Michelle stood there, her eyes widening slightly when she saw who it was. There was a moment of silence, the weight of the previous events hanging heavy between them. "Hi, Mrs. Phillips," Emily began, her voice shaky. I wanted to come and apologize. Is Jaden home?" Michelle studied her for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she stepped aside, allowing Emily to enter. She led her to the living room where Jaden and Robert were sitting. Jaden looked up, surprise flashing across his face when he saw Emily standing there, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he remembered. "Hi, Jaden," Emily said, her voice almost a whisper. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now, but I needed to come here and say that I'm really, really sorry." Jaden blinked, the tension in his body visible as he sat up straighter. He didn't say anything at first, his eyes locked on Emily's face, taking in her nervous posture and the tears welling in her eyes. "I know I messed up," Emily continued, her voice breaking. "I panicked, and I made assumptions that were wrong, horribly wrong. And because of that, you went through something terrible. I wish I could take it all back, but I know I can't. I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry." The room was quiet, the words hanging heavily in the air. Jaden looked down at his hands, the memories of that night flashing through his mind. The panic, the fear, the helplessness. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. He had imagined this moment countless times since that night, and now that it was happening, he didn't know how to feel. Michelle and Robert watched their son, their expressions softening. They knew how hard this was for him, how deeply it had affected him. After what felt like an eternity, Jaden finally looked up, meeting Emily's eyes. "I appreciate you coming here," he said quietly. "I really do. But it's not just about what happened that night. It's about what people think when they see someone like me. You weren't the first person to assume the worst, and you won't be the last. But I hope you've learned something from this." Emily nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I have," she whispered. "I've learned so much, and I promise I'll never make that mistake again. I want to do better." Jaden sighed, the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. "I believe you," he said finally, "and I forgive you, but it's going to take time for things to feel normal again." Emily gave a small, grateful smile. "I understand. Thank you for giving me a chance to apologize." Robert cleared his throat, his voice gentle as he spoke. "We appreciate you coming, Emily. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. We hope this will be a lesson for you, and for others. Assumptions can ruin lives." Michelle nodded, her expression still guarded. "We're trying to move forward, but it's hard. What happened to Jaden shouldn't have happened to anyone, and it's going to take us time to heal." Emily looked down, her heart aching for the pain she had caused. "I understand," she said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that I'm truly sorry." Jaden gave a small nod, his lips curving into a faint, almost sad smile. "It's okay," he said. "We all make mistakes. I just hope people can learn from this." They all sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past few weeks settling in the room. It wasn't an easy silence. It was heavy, filled with the hurt and the lessons learned. But there was also a sense of understanding, a tentative hope that maybe things could get better from here. Michelle broke the silence, her voice soft. "Would you like to stay for a bit, Emily? We're just about to have some tea." Emily looked up, surprised, her eyes still glistening with tears. She nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I'd love to." As they sat together, sipping tea and talking, there was a sense of cautious hope in the room. They spoke about everyday things: school, upcoming exams, hobbies. It wasn't easy, and the wounds from that night were still fresh, but it was a start. Jaden and Emily exchanged stories about school, Jaden talking about his plans to join the basketball team, and Emily sharing her love for photography. Slowly, the tension eased, and laughter filled the space. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. Later, as Emily was about to leave, she turned to Jaden. "I really hope we can move past this," she said. "I'd like us to be friends, if that's something you'd want." Jaden hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe one day," he replied. "I think that could be possible." Emily smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Thank you," she said simply before turning and heading out the door. As the door closed behind her, Michelle turned to Jaden, her eyes filled with pride. "You handled that really well, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. Jaden hugged her back, a small smile on his face. It wasn't easy, and it didn't change everything, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. The attempt at reconciliation left the family feeling both hopeful and drained. There was still a long way to go, but at least now there was a sense of closure. Jaden knew that while this experience had marked him, it had also shown him the importance of forgiveness and the power of standing up for what was right. The road ahead was uncertain, but they were ready to face it, together. The story of Jaden's wrongful arrest continued to make waves in the community. The video of the officers aggressively detaining him had gone viral, reaching people far beyond the city limits. The hashtag #JusticeForJaden was trending for days, and news channels picked up the story, showcasing the injustice that Jaden had faced. His story had become a symbol of the larger issue of racial profiling. The Phillips family was overwhelmed by the attention. While some of it was positive, people supporting Jaden and demanding justice, there was also a dark side. The online comments were a mix of support and hateful rhetoric, and it weighed heavily on Jaden. He didn't want to be a symbol of racism. He just wanted to be a normal teenager. But his parents, especially his father, Robert, saw an opportunity to use this attention for something good. "We can't let this be just another story that people forget," Robert said one evening, his voice determined. "We have to make sure this leads to real change." Michelle agreed, though she worried about the toll it was taking on Jaden. "I know," she said softly, "but we also need to think about Jaden. He's already been through so much." Jaden listened quietly, knowing that his parents were right. He had been thrust into the spotlight against his will, but if his experience could help make things better for others, then maybe it was worth it. The pressure from the public was impossible for the police department to ignore. In response to the outcry, they announced that they would be conducting a full investigation into the conduct of Officers Murphy and Blake, as well as reviewing their procedures for handling calls like the one that led to Jaden's arrest. The department also reached out to Jaden's family, offering a formal apology. Chief of Police Harold Lawson requested a meeting with the Phillips family, hoping to make amends and address the community's concerns. Robert and Michelle agreed to the meeting, though they were wary. They knew that apologies were often just words unless real action followed. They brought Jaden along, hoping that his presence would remind the police leadership of the human cost of their actions. The meeting was held in the community center with representatives from the police department, local activists, and community leaders present. The tension in the room was thick as Chief Lawson stood before the gathered crowd, his expression solemn. "We're here today to acknowledge the mistakes that were made and to apologize to Jaden and his family for what they went through," Chief Lawson began. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of discomfort in his eyes as he looked at Jaden. "The actions of our officers were unacceptable, and we are committed to making changes to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." Michelle held Jaden's hand tightly, her eyes locked on the chief. Robert sat beside them, his expression stern but hopeful. They had heard promises before, but this time they needed more than just words. Turner, the community advocate who had helped them from the beginning, stood up to speak next. "Chief Lawson, we appreciate the apology, but what we need are tangible actions," he said firmly. "The community needs to see that there are consequences for officers who abuse their power. We need transparency, accountability, and real reform." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jaden felt a swell of pride. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about changing the system. After the meeting, the Phillips family spoke to the press. Turner stood by their side, outlining the demands they were making to the police department. Better training to address racial bias, clear accountability measures for misconduct, and an independent oversight committee to handle complaints against officers. Jaden spoke briefly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else," he said, looking directly at the cameras. "I was just trying to do the right thing, and instead, I was treated like a criminal. I hope that by speaking out, we can make sure that no one else has to go through what I did." Michelle placed a hand on his shoulder, her heart swelling with pride. Her son had been through so much, but he had come out stronger, and now he was using his voice to fight for others. The momentum from the meeting and the public support led to real change. The police department announced several new initiatives, including a partnership with local civil rights organizations to provide ongoing training for officers on racial profiling and de-escalation techniques. They also committed to setting up an independent review board to handle complaints of police misconduct, giving the community a say in how these cases were addressed. Murphy and Blake, the officers responsible for Jaden's arrest, faced disciplinary action. They were suspended without pay, pending further investigation, and the public pressure made it clear that this was just the beginning. The community demanded accountability, and it seemed that, for once, their voices were being heard. In Jaden's school, the events also had a lasting impact. The administration organized a special assembly to address the issues of racial bias and discrimination. Turner was invited to speak, and he used the opportunity to educate the students on their rights and the importance of standing up against injustice. Jaden and Emily were both present, sitting near the front. As Turner spoke about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of empathy, Jaden glanced at Emily. She met his eyes and gave him a small, apologetic smile. Jaden nodded back. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. After the assembly, Jaden was approached by several classmates who offered their support. Some apologized for not stepping up sooner, while others simply wanted to let him know that they were proud of him. Jaden appreciated their words, though he knew that actions spoke louder. He hoped that this experience would open people's eyes and lead to real change, not just in the police force, but in the way people treated each other every day. One afternoon, a few weeks after the incident, Jaden and Emily met at the park. They walked in silence for a while before Emily spoke up. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said quietly. "I know that I can never undo what I did, but I want to make sure that I use my voice to help make things right." Jaden looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "You can't change the past, Emily, but we can all learn from it," he replied. "What matters is that you're willing to grow from this." Emily nodded, a sense of determination in her eyes. "I want to help. Whatever you're doing, any marches, protests, anything, I want to be part of it." Jaden smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Okay, we can always use more allies." The journey wasn't over. There were still many battles to be fought, and Jaden knew that the road ahead would be long. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. His family, his community, and even people like Emily were all ready to stand by his side and fight for what was right. As they walked through the park, Jaden felt a sense of hope. The pain of that night would always be there, but it had led to something greater. It had led to conversations, to change, and to a community coming together to demand better. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Jaden knew that they were on the right path. They were fighting for a future where no one had to fear being judged by the color of their skin. A future where empathy and understanding could overcome prejudice, and for Jaden, that was worth everything. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. We have many more of these stories to come. In the meantime, where are you watching this video? Write in the comments, and skip to the next videos. I'm sure they'll hook you.